1 Samuel chapter 22 is where we are today. The internet has produced so many useful things, but it has also facilitated so much that is, some of it's evil and some of it is just odd. And one of those things is conspiracy theories that have legs that they never would have had before. Now, I know that there are real conspiracies out there, and I'm going to tread real lightly because I don't know what conspiracy theories you might hold to or that I might hold to or what have you, but here's one I think we can all agree, I hope we all agree, is nuts. The flat earth theory, supposedly based on common sense observations, and the theory is, of course, that NASA staged the moon landing. And supposedly the ice caps which ring the edge of the world are guarded by NASA. Yeah. There are some conspiracy theories that are harmless in that they don't push people to do harm to others. That doesn't mean that they don't matter and they don't have consequence, but they don't matter as much as some other things. And then there are conspiracy theories that are not only crazy, but they make people crazy. And they do things that really harm other people, if not even just harming themselves. And it often feels like the fuzzy thinking that some folks get caught up in is impossible to shake them out of. Even God's people sometimes get wrapped up in some crazy ideas. Well, today in 1 Samuel 22, we see someone who had been God's choice man for a time, King Saul, who has wrapped himself up in a doozy of a conspiracy theory. The idea that David is out to get him. David has been in the forest of Hereth, is where we left him last week in 1 Samuel 22. Saul is up there in the northern part of that map in his capital city. And what we see, we're going to see in the story today, is that Saul's massacre of the ministers shows how twisted, dark minds can become when they oppose God's kingdom plan. David has been on the run since chapter 20. He'll be on the run until chapter 26. Last time we saw him, he was in the forest of Hereth. Previously, though, he had stopped in the priestly city of Nob, where he lied and got some assistance under false pretenses and went down to Gath and acted like a crazy man. Meanwhile, the crazy King Saul is still trying to get him, and we're going to see Saul today back in his capital. The story that we're going to begin today and continue the next time I'm in the pulpit is one of the most intense in the Bible. Some Jewish interpreters have likened it to a miniature Holocaust. In fact, some Jewish commentators have said that after reading this story, it is appropriate to sit in silence for a few moments. It is an awful account where an entire city, an entire generation of priests are killed, as well as the entire city in which they live, at the hand of the anointed one, the king of Israel, King Saul. And yet, as awful of a story as it is also a story that is very artfully written and recorded for us here in sacred Scripture. There are a number of double references that happen in this story. Saul will call the Benjaminites and say, "Hear now," and he says the same thing to Ahimelech later. "Listen now." Doeg twice will act first as an accuser and then a punisher. And the priests will make two movements. They'll move to Saul, and then the one survivor will move to David. So there are these pairings of events. This story, which we'll read in a moment, accomplishes a couple things for the people who read it in ancient days. It highlights how unworthy Saul had become to be king. It validates David as someone who's trustworthy and sensitive to the things of God. And it shows how God used David to maintain the priesthood and to prepare it for something greater than what it had been doing. So I'd like us at this moment to read this text. We'll not make it all the way through this passage in our study today, but I'd like us to get a feel for the whole of it, beginning in verse 6. Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now, Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the Tamarisk Tree on the height with a spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there's none of you who's sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day." Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob. And all of them came to the king. Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he said, "Here I am, my lord." Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who's captain over your bodyguard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair." But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." And the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priest, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants. Also oxen, donkeys, and sheep he struck with the edge of the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul. I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me." We come back to the beginning of this story, to just survey what we're going to see in this story. There are 4 movements to it, and we'll, the Lord willing, cover the first 2 today. It begins with the king's sort of discovery, and then moves on to the priest's slanted trial, followed by the enemy's savage slaughter, and then the priesthood's sole survivor who comes to David. The first of these we begin today in verses 6 through 8, the king's sort of discovery. You see, Saul received some partial intelligence in verse 6. Again, the beginning of verse 6, "Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered." Back in verse 2, we were told that as David was in the cave of Adullam, that everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him. He became the captain of them. Now there were about 400 men with him. That's what Saul hears about. Saul has ears for issues in his realm, informants here and there ready to snitch, people like Doeg the Edomite. We're not sure how much of David's travels Saul knew about. He apparently doesn't know exactly where they are, or else he might marshal an army and take them out. But the report that he gets, and it's a partial report, is all the proof he thinks he needs to support his conspiracy theory that David is out to get him. And as far as he's concerned, David is assembling a force that's preparing to challenge Saul. But this intelligence report is only partial, because the men around David are outliers, they're outcasts, but they are not anarchists. And the stories that follow this prove that David is not trying to kill Saul when he has ample opportunity to kill him with his own hand. He asserts again and again, "I will not touch the Lord's anointed." The change in the realm must come by God's hand, not David's. But Saul is not so good at this political math, and he takes 2 plus 2 and comes up with 22 and lights off into an irrational rage. He hasn't learned the wisdom that would be recorded in the Proverbs later about getting all the facts you can before you take a course of action. Proverbs 18:13, for instance, "He who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him." Big decisions, beloved, cannot be made on partial information. And if we forge ahead and just kind of massage info the way we want it to, we are guilty of willful ignorance. And we can bring great harm on others as well as ourselves. He has partial intelligence, but note now as the verse continues, he has complete paranoia. There's an ominous scene that's set for us in the middle of verse 6. Now, Saul, verse 6 says, Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the Tamarisk tree on the height, with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. Gibeah is the capital city of Saul. He is sitting in court, but not in the castle or the throne room. Instead, he has found a large, notable tree where sometimes royal meetings in the ancient days and even in the Bible were known to take place. Sometimes unusual trees were thought to have mystical significance. In fact, pagan peoples would often use the tamarisk tree to carve out wood to make idols. I don't know what's in Saul's mind about using this, but he's on a high point near the city underneath this auspicious tree. The tamarisk tree is really not a large tree in terms of its height, but it's very notable because it sprawls out with these long, tendrily leaves, and it has white and pink flowers at certain times of the year. Provides a lot of shade, and what's especially unusual about it is these trees don't naturally grow in places like Gibeah. They grow in the desert and in the dunes. So the fact that this unusual tree is there, it would catch people's attention. We don't know if it was intentionally planted or if this was a volunteer tree, but here he is in this unusual place. It would be sort of like weeping willows. They don't naturally grow around here. Occasionally you see one and it sort of catches your eye. Oh, that's sort of out of place. That's interesting. That's the kind of setting that Saul has here. Saul, interestingly, in chapter 31, will be buried under a tree like this. It's an auspicious tree, but Saul's posture is ominous. He's there with a spear in his hand. The stories of Samuel mention 15 times Saul's spear. It's like a constant threat to anyone around him. Twice he tries to impale David with it, even tried to impale his own son Jonathan with it. And before this story is over, he is going to order an act of extreme violence. The author wants us to see that Saul is in this very powerful stance, and yet he is holding on to his authority with the thinnest of threads. He holds on to power by fear and coercion and deception. Fear, coercion, and deception. These are terrible ways for anybody to lead anything. You know, there's a time and a place and a need at times for what you might call a command and control approach to leadership, where things are in a volatile state and you just need to tightly govern things. But there is never a need to lead by tear down and terrorizing. That's what Saul has become. This is an important word for us in the modern day, whether we are in positions of leadership as parents or bosses or coaches, teachers, supervisors, older siblings. Not to lead by coercion and domination, but instead to lead more by example and a proper use of authority. One commentator has said that Saul has the appearances of security, but it's all an illusion. Saul was full of fears. So let's listen to him now as we come to verses 7 and 8, where we see the imagined conspiracy. Verse 7, Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites." This speech is not starting off all that nice. Listen up. It's the same way he will address Ahimelech in verse 11. He is about to let the Benjamites have it. The Benjamites are his own tribal people. He is from that tribe. Gibeah is a Benjamite town. And what this indicates is that most of the chief men that Saul has surrounded around himself are his fellow tribesmen. And actually, that means they are his fellow relatives to one degree or another. Listen up, Benjamites. And then the verse continues, "Will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds?" Now, what's implied in these rhetorical questions is that Saul has been giving his relatives kickbacks. He's been giving them properties and positions as kickbacks. Kings in the ancient Near East were notorious for doing this. They wanted to win the loyalty, especially of their military officers. So they would just give properties to people to keep them happy. And now what they would do with that then is, let's say, the lands, the fields, these are farmlands. So you now own more land than you had. You rent it out to crop-sharing people. You charge them rent for the land. And then when they harvest, you take a whopping percentage of the harvest. And sometimes the people working on the land were the ones who owned it previously. That's quite a racket. And the same thing with vineyards. These are high-earning agricultural centers, rented out at regular rates, and then you get a high percentage of the vintage. Those are the properties. And then there's the positions, commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, various levels of military and government authority. That's what we're to understand is that this is what Saul had been doing. He'd been doling this out. Now, where are these lands and vineyards coming from? He's not creating them. He's taxing it away from people, stealing it away from people. And this would become a problem with Israel's kings for centuries. You remember the story of Naboth, who lost his vineyard to the king in 1 Kings 21. That's the sort of thing going on behind this. Saul doesn't realize it, but he is actually fulfilling a prophecy. Samuel had told Israel back in chapter 8, if you want a king on your own terms, then this is what you're going to get. He's going to confiscate your lands. He's going to tax you to death. He's going to take your choice workers, your own children, and conscript them to do what he wants. And sure enough, that's what he did. How good to know that there is a coming king who is not going to govern that way, who will govern righteously. And I'm not talking about David. David would be far better. David was God's choice all along. But I'm talking about David's greatest son, King Jesus. He's coming, and he's going to establish a reign like this world has never seen, and it will be empty of corruption. Until then, we ought to live in a way so that the world round about us can see what righteous dealings look like. Honesty in our business, dealing with customers, dealing with our government, at school, in sports, even, at home and in our family, to demonstrate the kind of righteousness that the kingdom will be known for when it comes in its fullness. With the statement that Saul has just made, there are three points, I suppose. There's a suspicion behind what he says, there's an argument he makes, and then there's a threat he makes. Some of these are implied. The implied suspicion is that they're all hoping that when David comes to power, they're going to get more land and more vineyards and more power. That's the suspicion. The argument is, you cannot expect David to show you favors like I've shown you. You're not in the right tribe. David's not from the tribe of Benjamin. He's from what? The tribe of Judah. So it's going to be his cronies who get elevated, argues Saul. And then there's the threat. The implied threat is, if you don't show me loyalty now, I'll take away your fields and your vineyards and your positions. And next, in verse 8, comes the even bigger accusation. Look at the paranoia here in verse 8. For all of you have conspired against me, so that there's no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. There's none of you who's sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day. Here is the conspiracy theory in all of its wacky glory. He thinks they're all in on it. 3 times. All of you. No one. None of you. This Hebrew word for conspired is a word for tying things up together with ropes and knots. So they're all bound up into this vast system to bring me down. Really, what he's saying is it's a conspiracy of silence. He can't point to anything specific that people have done. It's what they haven't done. You've not been telling me enough about what's going on. And of course, they can't tell him what's going on because most of what he thinks is going on isn't going on. And the parts that are true, he wouldn't understand rightly anyway. And look at the way he speaks about David. He can't even say David's name. He's just the son of Jesse. He did this back in chapter 20. He'll hardly ever say David's name again. Saul is convinced there's a conspiracy afoot, but in reality, he's the one who's turning people's hearts away from him. David is not the orchestrator of some kind of coup. Saul even claims that David is trying to ambush him somehow. Who's trying to ambush who? You've heard these stories. And on top of all of this twisted, convoluted thinking, he makes this self-serving, sick, emotional appeal. None of you care about me. Some of you have been in relationships where there's drama like this. It just doesn't match up with reality at all. And notice the response that the servants give. Nobody says a word. Because they've learned, it doesn't matter how many words you say to try to counter this, he won't listen. Maybe they're hoping this will just blow over like it's done before. But someone, unfortunately, breaks the silence. And we wish that he had not broken the ice. And so in verse 9 is the beginnings of the priest's slanted trial. Doeg makes an accusation in verses 9 and 10. Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Good old Doeg has come back on the scene. He was mentioned just in passing back in chapter 21, verse 7, where David has come to the priestly city of Nob, and he's lying his way around to get some help. And we're told there that one of the servants, chapter 21, verse 7, one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. And that's all that's said about him there, but it sets the stage for what he does here. Doeg was an attaché to Saul's royal court. He was not an Israelite. He's an Edomite, a people who historically had been opposed to the Israelites, but somehow he has wormed his way into positions of power. Sometimes, ancient kings would intentionally hire outsiders because they may not have as much of a vested interest in the realm. Remember, later on, David will have one of his chief commanders is Uriah Uriah the Hittite, a non-Israelite who he trusted, who he betrayed, sadly. Doeg, though, is trying to work his way up the ladder, apparently, and he thinks he's now found a way to more power. He accuses the high priest of sedition. And just like Saul can't bring himself to say David's name, neither can Doeg. He calls him son of Jesse. He's as opposed to David as Saul is. He rats out David for going to Nob to get supplies and rats out Ahimelech for assisting him. Of course, if you remember that story, Ahimelech didn't have any certain knowledge that Saul was trying to kill David. That's a very important detail that Doeg has intentionally and deceptively left out. Remember the story, David lied about why he was there. This, by the way, this notion that Doeg was a better liar than David comes out in Psalm 52, which we'll be looking at this evening. In several verses, the opening verses, David decries the wicked tongue that deceives, and how God will eventually bring him to judgment. David's white lie is here overpowered by Doeg's black lie. What an important lesson it is here about truth-telling. You know, one lie often begets another, even from other people. You know the old proverb, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. You know, it's not just a tangled web it makes, it sometimes turns into a trap that ensnares and harms many people. In verse 10, Doeg claims that something happened at Nob in addition to David getting the bread and getting a sword. What he says is that the high priest gave David some special word from God. Now, the story in chapter 21 doesn't share that detail with us. I think the author is withholding that information here because it heightens the drama. But it's not really all that surprising. David is a man who often sought God's help, sought God's face, sought insight from the Lord as to what he ought to do. Even in that story where his motives are mixed and his thinking is a bit muddled, I'm certain that he asked Ahimelech for some encouraging word from God, whether God would be with them or something simple like that. Normally, asking a priest for making an inquiry of the Lord, you would get some sort of a simple response back. There's actually examples of it in the chapters that follow, we'll see in weeks to come. The priests weren't usually prophets, but they could seek answers from the Lord, especially when they put on the Urim and Thummim, or maybe wearing a special ephod. Saul has cut himself off from any word from God. And now he's going to do his best to cut off any source of revelation from God. In verses 11 and 12, the priests are summoned. Verse 11, then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. A little subtle change. For the first time in the story, Saul is just called the king, which indicates that he's summoning these priests not on some level as fellow worshipers of the Lord, as more that he's summoning them like a warlord. As the king of Israel, he is supposed to be a patron of the priesthood. He's supposed to be funding them and supporting them and directing them. He would have some authority over them. But he's summoning them for a meeting for which they don't know what it's all about. They know it must be big, so they all come. And here's a map that shows you Gibeah there in the north, and Nob, we think, is about 2 miles to the southeast. So it would have taken the messengers about an hour to get down to Nob, and then these, we'll find out later, 86 priests have to stop what they're doing and get themselves ready and walk back up the road for another hour. So hours will pass. But they all come, and then court reconvenes. All his father's household, all his relatives who were involved in the priestly work. I don't know if you remember, but last week when David went to the cave of Adullam, we're told in verse 1 that all of his father's household came to him. And now here's Ahimelech. All of his father's household comes with him, but not for safety. They're coming for destruction. And look at the ominous greeting that Saul gives them in verse 12. Saul said, listen now, son of Ahitub. The same phrase he gave to the Benjamites earlier. And Ahitub gives this reverential, respectful response. He answered, here I am, my lord. And you notice Saul doesn't even call him by his first name, son of Ahitub. Ralph Davis said, Saul is on a last name basis with just about everybody. One can't help but notice a sense of distance in the way he talks to people, a distance created by his madness and his alienation from God. Beginning in verse 13 is the interrogation that Saul lays on him. Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, and that you've given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day?" Earlier, Saul had accused his court workers of being in league with David. And now there's an even harsher accusation. See, back in verse 8, it was just, "You haven't told me enough." Now here's some concrete activity that Saul can point at and say, "See this? This is an act of sedition." The thing that seems to bother Saul the most is this fact that he inquired of the Lord. When Doeg mentioned what the priest had done, he said he inquired of the Lord, and he gave him bread, and he gave him a sword. And notice how Saul turns that around. He puts the inquiring of the Lord in the last position, almost like it's the most significant thing. And in fact, it's the issue that Ahimelech will try to explain the most. It's interesting. Saul doesn't even use God's name in this verse. You inquired of God. He doesn't use Yahweh. He's not even on a first name basis with God. And he repeats his crazy conspiracy theory about David laying in ambush like it's some present threat, as it is this day. Any moment he could come up the road with those troops, wherever they are. Saul is angry with Ahimelech, but really he's angry with God. Because this word from God to David was not a word from Ahimelech. It was a word from God. So there's this sort of veiled anger that the Lord would be giving David any good word at all. Ahimelech simply told David what God had said. You know, friends, you and I are called to be God's messengers. Don't be surprised if you get in trouble for repeating what God has told you and what he's told us in his word. A lot of people really don't want to hear it because it goes cross purposes against their whole view of the world, their whole view of life, really their conspiracy theory, their false view of the way that the world runs. Richard Phillips said, "Notice that Saul is angry with Ahimelech simply for doing his duty as God's servant. People are likewise outraged when Christian ministers preach the commands and doctrines of God's word, forgetting that this is the very function to which they are called by the Lord." Saul's interrogation is now followed by Ahimelech's defense in verses 14 to 15. And Ahimelech is going to make a two-part reply. First, he's going to address this conspiracy theory part, arguing that it can't be true because David is so trustworthy. And secondly, he's going to address this issue of passing on a word from God and explain that this is nothing abnormal, and it certainly wasn't anything corrupt. So look at verse 14. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful? He's honored in your house." He doesn't believe a word about what Saul has said about David. David has built up a reputation as being so honorable. Not perfect, mind you, but very honorable. And Ahimelech reasons that, when David came to me, he was an emissary from you, and he shows up. I'm obligated to serve him. Everything I know about him is that he's trustworthy. In fact, there's 4 credentials he lists out for David. He's most faithful. He's the captain. He's the king's son-in-law. I mean, he's in your family, Saul. You set him up with your daughter. Let's not forget that. He was captain of the king's bodyguard and highly honored in Saul's house. I mean, everyone loved David, except Saul. What a wonderful testimony David had gained. Sometimes we preachers will ask this question. It's a good question. It's a thought-provoking question. If you were put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And by that, I don't mean the things you say. I mean, there's our verbal testimony, what we say about our relationship to the Lord and what the Lord has done for us. But then there's our visual testimony, what other people who see us rightly say. It's important for us to have both a verbal testimony and a visual testimony so that our deeds match up with our words. And it was largely true of David. He was faithful, most faithful, a term used to describe Samuel, the prophet, a couple times. David was honored, a term used to describe how Samuel was regarded by the people. David is like a royal version of Samuel. David is his protege in a way. Ahimelech's words here not only defend himself, this is why I helped him, but really he's defending David. And for the people of ancient Israel, as they were hearing this book for the first time, it highlighted how David really was God's chosen one all along. Ahimelech tries to reason with Saul about David, just like Jonathan had tried to reason with Saul. But Saul will not be moved. Now, Ahimelech's defense moves on to another stage in verse 15. Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? The thought being, look, this is not the first time he has come to Tabernacle and asked, is there some word of God for me? Some word of encouragement, some bit of guidance. There's nothing unusual about this. We know from the Psalms that David is a man who frequently went to tabernacle, who would bring thank offerings and declare what the Lord had done. And sometimes the Psalms indicate that there's actually, some of the Psalms include a word from God of encouragement that the Lord would be with him. So the argument here is there's nothing unusual about this. And then Ahimelech goes on to say he doesn't know anything about any conspiracy. Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of his household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. Far be it from me. The Hebrew phrase is an idiom. It's literally a profane, disgusting thing to me. Far be it from me is a fair enough rendering, but these words coming from a priest were so significant. See, the priests, every day they're careful not to touch profane things, things that would make them ceremonially unclean and thus keep them from doing their duties. And he describes this whole conspiracy idea as this disgusting thing that I want to stay away from. He and his family of priests didn't know anything about all this mess, nothing at all, not in small or in great. Ahimelech's ignorance of things is going to lead to his death, though. And we'll end today by looking at the sentence that's pronounced in verse 16 by Saul. The king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." Well, that was a quick trial. Looks like the outcome was pretty much predetermined. Guilty verdict is even bypassed, and we've gone straight on to sentencing. And how almost disgusting that Saul uses the very words of God's curse in Genesis 3, "You shall surely die," as if he is in this godlike position. Saul, with a spear in his hand, sits as a death-dealing dictator. And not only is Ahimelech sentenced, but his entire family, your father's household, idiom meaning at least 3 generations of his family. And why are they drawn into this? And it seems like some of Saul's reasoning has been influenced by the pagan nations round about him. Archaeologists have found documents of the kingdom of the Hittites and the kingdom of Mari that show that the kings saw themselves as having direct authority over the priests, and that the priests in those nations were obligated to protect the king at all costs. And that even if the priest gave a word of prophecy, though it's bogus prophecy in those pagan realms, if they give some word of prophecy to someone who is on the outs with the king, it is viewed as sedition. And the penalty is not only death for the priest, but for their entire family. The priests in one city-state actually would make an oath to the king not to give a word of prophecy to anybody except without reporting it to the king directly. Saul is fashioning himself like a pagan king. There's none of that in the law. In the law of Moses, the priests are supposed to be a counter-influence to the king, to keep him in line with the law of God. But Saul has become a law to himself. The real basis of all of this is his suspicion and his ego. Saul's massacre of the ministers shows us just how twisted dark minds can become when they're opposed to God's kingdom plan. Saul wants his kingdom. He could not pray, as Jesus taught us, "Your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven," because the way Saul had been, there was no more room for him in that realm. When we come next time to this story, we'll see the enemy's savage slaughter, the mournful scene of Doeg killing the priests and then going down the road and killing everyone and everything in the town in an extreme act of vengeance. All killed, but one sole survivor of the priesthood finds his way down to David. And God keeps alive the line that would, again, help the kingdom to go forward. You know, there's good news. God is very good at keeping the line alive. You think about it, Saul is kind of an antichrist. He is opposed to the Lord's anointed, be they the priests or be they the true king. But God keeps the line alive. And it will not be the last time that God will keep the line alive. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, there's efforts to squelch and cut off the line of David, the whole people of Israel. Even in the days of our Lord Jesus, when he came in that time so pregnant with fulfillment, and Herod the Great tries to kill all the children in the place where he was, God keeps the line alive. And how good for us that no matter what opposition we might face by those opposed to God's kingdom plan, God will keep his line alive. He is, you see, given us everlasting life. So, yes, the body they may kill, but God's truth abideth still. And our Lord Jesus has promised to be with us and for us to be with him in his everlasting kingdom forever.